Okay, let's unpack this. We're looking at a really significant potential shift in how the U.S. federal government might spend its money in 2026.
That's right. And you, our listener, are looking for clarity, a solid handle on what's actually being proposed.
Exactly. We want to give you the essential info without, getting totally lost in the weeds.
Precisely. Because it's not just numbers, is it? It's about priorities. And understanding those tells you a lot.
So the core of it, based on the materials we have, is President Trump's budget plan. There's a proposed cut, a big one, $163 billion from domestic spending. Now, where's that money supposedly going instead?
Well, the focus seems pretty clear. Bolstering national security and border control.
Right. The sources we looked at, the text and that New Orleans City business piece, they both highlight this kind of fundamental shift.
The reallocation, yeah.
So today we'll dig into which domestic areas face cuts, the reasoning the administration gives, and the potential ripple effects, all based on the info you shared.
It's really about connecting the dots for you, why these changes, and what could the landscape look like afterwards.
Okay, let's start with the big picture then. What's the overall scale here?
The source text lays it out quite clearly. That $163 billion cut, it's specifically non-defense domestic spending.
Okay, non-defense.
And what's really striking is that's a 23% reduction in that category.
23%? Wow.
Yeah. To give you some perspective, that would apparently bring that kind of spending down to its lowest point since 2017. So it gives you a real sense of the scale of the rollback being proposed.
A 23% cut is, that's a major recalibration. And on the flip side, where are the big increases planned?
The City Business article gives us some figures there. A proposed 13% bump overall for national security.
Okay.
And within that, defense looks set for a hefty increase, $113.3 billion more. And Homeland Security, another $42.3 billion.
So a very clear, very deliberate shift in focus.
Absolutely. A statement of priorities.
And according to the sources, what's the philosophy? What's driving this proposed shift?
The text we have spells out the administration's main goal: protecting the nation's borders, strengthening national security.
Right.
And that's tied directly to goals like stopping illegal immigration and reducing crime. That seems to be the core objective you need to grasp to understand the thinking here.
Got it. Okay. Now let's dive into the specifics. Where are these cuts actually falling? Which domestic areas face the biggest hits?
Well, several key areas are looking at potentially quite deep cuts. Education, for one.
Education, how much?
The text points to a potential 15% cut for the Department of Education. And, that's not just trimming around the edges.
No, 15% sounds significant. What could that mean in practice?
It could mean a lot of things. Maybe fewer teachers, less support for students who are struggling academically, fewer programs aimed at helping disadvantaged kids. The text even mentions things like after-school activities potentially being canceled. That impacts working families.
So, definitely.
Yeah.
That paints a concerning picture for schools. What about housing? The numbers for HUD seem pretty dramatic too.
They really are. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, could see almost half its budget cut.
Half?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And you have to remember, HUD helps low-income families find housing. So cuts like that, as the source highlights, could mean way less rental assistance, fewer affordable housing programs.
And who does that hit hardest?
Well, potentially vulnerable groups, right? The elderly, people with disabilities, single-parent families often rely on that kind of support.
So impacting some really vulnerable communities.
Yeah.
Okay. Moving to health, the proposed cuts for NIH and CDC, those numbers really jumped out.
They did. And what's particularly striking is just the sheer size of the proposed cuts. Over 40% funding reduction for both the National Institutes of Health and the CDC. That's according to the text.
Over 40% for both.
Yes. And the City Business article gives specific numbers. CDC could lose nearly $3.6 billion. NIH, almost $18 billion.
That's huge. Just to put it in context, what levels are we talking about returning to?
Well, cuts like that could potentially take funding for critical health research and, pandemic preparedness back to levels we haven't seen since the early 2000s.
So potentially rolling back years of investment.
That's the concern, yeah. Reversing progress in these really vital areas.
For anyone listening who might not be super familiar, can you just quickly recap what NIH and CDC actually do? Why are these cuts potentially so concerning?
Sure. So NIH is basically the government's engine for medical research. They fund and conduct studies to find treatments, cures for all sorts of diseases. Hugely important.
Okay.
And the CDC, that's the nation's public health agency. They track diseases, prevent outbreaks, respond to health emergencies, promote promote wellness.
Right, the ones we hear from during, say, a pandemic.
Exactly. So cutting their funding so drastically could really hamper our ability to deal with future health crises, and it could slow down the pace of medical advances generally.
Okay, another agency mentioned for cuts, maybe one people don't think about as much in this context, is the IRS. What's the story there?
Yeah, the text outlines a proposed cut of about $2.5 billion for the Internal Revenue Service.
The IRS. Their job is collecting taxes, right? So what's the argument for cutting their funding?
Well, the counter-argument, and it's a big one raised in the text, is that cutting IRS funding could actually hurt their ability to do their job effectively.
How so?
Fewer resources might mean fewer audits, especially maybe on very high earners or big corporations. Less enforcement, generally.
And the potential consequence of that.
Less tax revenue collected. So the concern is if the IRS can't collect the taxes that are legally owed, the national debt could actually go up.
Interesting. So it could potentially counteract one of the stated goals of cutting spending overall.
That's the worry some people have, yes.
Beyond these major agencies, were there other notable cuts or program eliminations mentioned?
Oh yeah, the City Business article lists quite a few more. The State Department and international programs face a huge proposed cut 84% reduction, down to maybe $9.6 billion.
84% for the State Department.
That's what the source says. Also, the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, LIHEAP, that would be completely eliminated.
LIHEAP helps people pay heating bills, right?
Yeah.
Especially in winter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Crucial support for vulnerable households, especially during cold snaps or heat waves. Eliminating it could be really tough for many families.
What else?
Cuts to college work-study programs, about $980 million there. Cuts to adult education, English language classes. Also, over $15 billion from infrastructure programs linked to climate change, and $1.3 billion from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Wow, so it's a really wide range of domestic programs facing significant reductions or just being wiped out entirely.
It appears so based on this proposal.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Let's talk about the arguments around these cuts.
Yeah.
What are the main points from supporters? Why do they think this is the right way to go?
Well, supporters, drawing from the text, really focus on strengthening border security, stopping illegal immigration. That's a major theme. They argue these steps will help reduce crime. And there's a broader argument that the federal government is just too big, too wasteful.
So fiscal responsibility, reducing the debt.
That's definitely part of the rationale presented. Addressing that huge national debt, over $36 trillion, the sources remind us. So from their viewpoint, it's about prioritizing. National security comes first.
Okay. And on the other side, what are the main worries and arguments from critics or opponents of these cuts?
Critics, again, looking at the text, are really concerned about the impact on vulnerable people. Low-income families, the elderly, people with disabilities who depend on these programs.
The ones we talked about with housing and LIHEAP, for example.
Exactly. There are also big concerns about the long-term damage, things like education and public health, slowing down medical research, fewer opportunities for students.
In the IRS point you mentioned earlier.
Yes. The concern that cutting the IRS could paradoxically increase the debt if tax collection suffers. And some critics also argued these cuts kind of go against past promises made to working Americans about supporting domestic programs.
So a really clear clash of priorities, different ideas about what the government should be doing.
Definitely. A fundamental disagreement on the role and size of government.
Okay, finally, let's talk about the politics of this, the process. This is a proposal, right? Not set in stone.
Not at all, no. The City Business article calls it a touchstone. It signals the administration's intent, sets the agenda for the budget debates.
Which happen where? In Congress?
In Congress, yes. They hold the power of the purse, as they say. Congress has to review this, debate it, they can change it significantly, potentially, before anything becomes law.
And are we already seeing disagreements about it?
We are, even within the Republican Party, apparently. The text mentions Senator Susan Collins expressing concerns.
About what specifically?
About the impact on vulnerable people, like we discussed. And interestingly, even questioning if the proposed military spending increases are actually enough. So these kinds of internal debates will be really important going forward.
Interesting. The sources also mentioned something called Project 2025. How does that connect?
Both sources link this budget proposal to Project 2025's broader goals, which, advocate for a much smaller federal government.
Oh, okay.
And the fact that Russell Vought, who was OMB director before and is a key figure in Project 2025, is involved again, well, that reinforces the connection.
And there was also mention of a rescission package. What's that about?
Right. The text refers to that. It's basically asking Congress to cancel spending that was already approved, kind of like taking back money.
Did they just do that?
Well, the article notes it could face legal challenges. Congress controls appropriations, so trying to cancel funds unilaterally might be seen as an executive overreach. It's complicated.
Okay. And just briefly, how does this all fit with other potential policies like tax cuts or tariffs?
Well, the city business piece points out this budget is proposed alongside talk of potential tax cuts, which naturally raises questions about the overall impact on the deficit and debt.
Right. Cutting spending, but maybe also cutting revenue.
Exactly. And there are ongoing debates, even among Republicans, about how to balance spending cuts with the economic effects of things like tariffs. So it's a complex political mix.
Okay. So to wrap this up for you, our listener, what we've looked at is a proposal for a really major shift in federal spending priorities.
It's a big shift, yeah.
The idea is to move significant funds away from a whole range of domestic programs, education, housing, health research, energy assistance, and more, and redirecting that towards national security and border control.
And this proposal, as we've discussed, has sparked a lot of debate. Strong arguments on both sides about the potential upsides and downsides.
And the whole thing now goes to Congress. They'll debate it, likely change it. The final outcome is still uncertain.
Absolutely. Our goal here in this deep dive was just to give you a clear, concise overview of what's in the proposal, the thinking behind it, and the potential impacts, all based on the sources provided.
And maybe one final thought for you to chew on based on everything we've talked about. Considering the sheer scale of these proposed changes, what do you think? What would be the biggest long-term opportunities or maybe the greatest risks for the country if a budget like this were actually put into place?
It's definitely something worth thinking about, a complex question with far-reaching implications.
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive.